Thanks very much indeed, Keith. Our second speaker this evening is Jim McDermott. Jim is a former head of history in Corpus Christi College in West Belfast. He is the author of several books, one a study of Belfast in the Anglo-Irish War, Northern Divisions, and more recently he's been a member of a project looking at the connection between nationalist West Belfast and the Great War, really. A project looking at the 3,000 men from West Belfast, or the Falls Road area in particular, who joined the Connaught Rangers. And this has been published twice in the last 3 or 4 years and has involved people really digging out of their attics death pennies, extracts from diaries, letters from chaplains in the Western Front, and kind of knitting together a lost story, really, of Joe Devlin's army, Belfast nationalism, and the Great War. This evening, Jim is addressing Ulster Catholics and Belfast in particular and the Great War. Jim McDermott.
Good evening. Nice to see such a big crowd. All hear me okay? Okay. I want to start off with a very famous speech, the most famous speech that Churchill ever made about Ireland. And it sums up World War I and Ireland's role in it to some extent. And I want to go on from that to examine why it was that Irish nationalists generally, but in the North in particular, and in particular perhaps in Belfast, why their experiences of the Great War have been so submerged. Until recently, with attempts by the Connaught Rangers Association, which I was privileged to be asked to contribute to, the experiences of Irish nationalists in the Great War tended to be forgotten or submerged. Whereas Unionist family connections to the Great War was celebrated to a large extent. And I think I could illustrate this best by 2 points made in Richard Grayson's book. He says that the last person to have died from the Western Front was James Coleman from Shankill in 1989. And the Royal Flying Corps, a fellow called Abe Kirkpatrick, died in 1996. There is no corresponding memory on the Falls Road. There's no corresponding memory. Yet the sacrifices that anybody suffered that participated in this war were very similar. And I want to ask tonight why it is that people chose within Irish nationalism so often to make their remembrance private, unlike Unionist remembrance of the Great War, which has become part of the fabric of their culture, and quite rightly so. And the quotation I was going to make was, of course, as the deluge subsides at the end of the war, Churchill said, as the deluge subsides and the waters fall short, we see again the dreary steeples of Fermanagh and Tyrone emerging once again. The integrity of their quarrel is one of the few institutions that has been unaltered in the cataclysm which has swept the world. Now, he made specific reference to the two counties, Fermanagh and Tyrone, because they were much debated counties. People within them, there was a slight nationalist majority. And where you drew the border was once very, very important up until the First World War. And it was anticipated if there was going to be trouble in the North over Home Rule, that this is where it could start. Oddly enough, there was great recruitment from Fermanagh and Tyrone especially. The regiments of volunteers seemed to treat each other with great cordiality, if we look at the newspapers at the time. But there is no doubt that you're looking at, and Philip will deal with this in more detail, the 36th Ulster Division, you're looking at volunteer armies. Keith made reference to why people joined the army, and their motives were always going to be mixed. Adventure, desire for travel, escape, thinking the war was over, but it is inescapable that both nationalists and unionists who joined the war were essentially political volunteers. The letters of Wilfred and Lillian Spender, recently published. Well, Wilfred Spender was an officer in the 36th Ulster Division, later to be in charge of the civil service here. At one time, the youngest officer in the Imperial General Staff. An Englishman, by the way, he resigned to join the 36th Ulster Division out of conviction to hold together the empire. But it makes clear that there's a great political belief within the 36th Ulster Division that this is a big sacrifice, that this should deliver Ulster from Home Rule, from what they considered, a very, very bad thing. And in retrospect, despite the awful sufferings of the Somme and elsewhere, it has to be said that 6 counties were not included in a Home Rule resolution at the end of the war. Now, this was unforeseen. When the war started in 1914, the overall demand of Irish nationalism was Home Rule. Separatism was not yet on the map. And people who joined the war on the nationalist side believed that the inevitability of Home Rule would come as a result of their joining up. On the Falls Road, for example, recruitment was very, very strong. Nationalism in Belfast, 1914, nationalists in Belfast represented less than a quarter of the population. Possibly it's hard to know. Certainly, proportionally they joined in equal numbers and suffered correspondingly. Throughout Ireland, people joined up. When Redmond's volunteers split from the movement originally set up, the Irish Volunteers, to create Home Rule, by far the majority supported Redmond. They supported the idea of fighting in the war. Patriotism itself would have been a very strong element of it. They would have considered themselves in many ways, many of the volunteers, as Australians. They might have wanted a certain measure of independence, but regarded membership of the British Empire then as very important. So very, very quickly, let's look at what happened. Where was the sea changes? I think the first point that ought to be made is when John Redmond in Dublin and a very, very able lieutenant, Joe Devlin, in Belfast, decided to encourage people to join the war, to become in effect recruiting sergeants, they were taking something of a political risk. If the Great War had been short, if the Allies had been victorious, if Home Rule had been passed, they would have been lauded today as heroes. It was not to be that way. The war was long. Original rush of recruitment was very, very enthusiastic. There was then a tailing off. There was casualties, and there was war weariness. Now that was true of Britain generally. Recruitment dropped off. But in Ireland, there were other factors which caused the soldiers at the front to be at a dissonance, I suppose, from the home front back in Ireland. For one thing, the propaganda campaign for British recruitment was very, very effective, as Keith makes clear in his book. 2 million posters of Kitchener and people like that, pictures of Lusitania. But there were different interpretations from the word go. There was also a very effective anti-war propaganda, which tapped in people like Arthur Griffith, Countess Markievicz, which tapped in the experience from the Boer War, which opposed the war. And we're very careful to say, look, we don't oppose Irish soldiers. We oppose the conduct of the war generally. We oppose the idea that the Irish should fight in this war. Patrick Pearse, for example, never referred to the First World War. He only referred to England's war. This is the way he's seen it. So there were interpretations of, for example, the Lusitania, which Keith showed a very famous poster of. Charlie Brett, a very able soldier, leader of the Connaught Rangers, and many of his men from the Falls Road, he was there when the Lusitania sank. And he seen the bodies lined up, racked off Kinsale in May 1915. He seen the dead civilians, and he said it made him just determined to kill as many Germans as possible. He was joined by the Kinsale Council, by the way, which apologised to the Huns for calling them Germans. This was different from the anti-recruiting campaign of the time, which said, look, you know, the Lusitania is an auxiliary ship of the Royal Navy. It was carrying munitions. There was no Royal Navy protection. They were trying to point toward perfidious Albion. And some factors helped them. In 1915, for example, Gallipoli, the first time that an Irish regiment was involved was the 10th. The Irish Division was the 10th Irish Division, arguably the least political. And their sacrifices at Gallipoli were very large. 900 Munster Fusiliers died. Kathleen Tynan, she said, like, this is not properly regarded by the British authorities. Our sacrifices aren't appreciated. And although Home Rule had been put in the statute book in September 1914, it had been suspended to the end of hostilities until the Great War ended, and there was as yet unspecified treatment of Ulster. As the war went on, so the prospect of Home Rule looked less likely to people. Irish casualties grew. Redmond himself didn't look a very convincing figure. He wouldn't take part in war cabinets until Home Rule was passed, though Edward Carson would. By 1916, some historians like Ben Novick argue that the Easter Rising could tap in to a certain war weariness and antipathy to the war, and becomes a fulcrum upon which a sea change happens of Irish opinion. You're all familiar with what happened at the Easter Rising. You're familiar with probably, you know, some of the quotations, Lady Fingal describing it like watching a closed door with blood flowing underneath. Morris Moore saying that a few unknown men shot against the barrack wall has changed everything in Ireland. That after the executions by Sir John Maxwell, people did start to drift towards Sinn Féin. No quick process. But the war was to go on another over 2.5 years after Easter 1916. No end in sight and no Home Rule likely. Nationalists moved quickly, rapidly, from 1917 on to a position of support for Sinn Féin. A misnomer, by the way. Sinn Féin, of course, that was to contest the 19 elections, are by no means the Sinn Féin of 1916, which didn't organise Easter Rising. The newspapers accused them of that. But by 1918, when the war did end, the demand of nationalism was for separatism, a republic. The old Irish Parliamentary Party had been wiped out, retaining only 6 seats, most of them in Ulster. Within the Republican movement itself, within the Irish independence movement, probably the most dramatic break they had split among themselves. After 1916, Asquith had asked Lloyd George to persuade both parties, the Irish Parliamentary Party and Unionists, to support the war. And he had went separately to Sir Edward Carson, give him a written undertaking that 6-county exclusion of Ulster would be permanent. He gave an oral undertaking to John Redmond that 6-county exclusion would be while the war lasted. He was afraid of America not coming in. At 23rd of June, at a very acrimonious meeting, Black Friday meeting down in the Old St Mary's Hall in Bank Street in Belfast, the Irish Parliamentary Party constituency groupings, the UIL, had a meeting, and 6 County Ulster was represented. They voted 470, thanks largely to Joe Devlin's speech, 475 to 265 to accept temporary exclusion of Ulster, to aid, to facilitate the progress of the war. But there were accusations from Fermanagh and Tyrone, Drury steeples off, that the convention had been rigged, that the border was going to be rejigged somehow. Belfast didn't care. They were a minority. They would always be in a minority to unionism, but not so Fermanagh and Tyrone. They said that people had filibustered, spoke too long, buses were allowed to go, and so on. It was an insult to be called a Black Fridayist in Tyrone and Fermanagh for 10 years after it. So as the war did come to an end then, better move on a bit, going too slow. As the war did come to an end, soldiers coming home, what did they find? Well, they'd fought, say from Belfast. They'd enlisted to get home rule. Had they got home rule? No. What had they got? Partition. They didn't join for that. They found that the things they joined for were gone. People who hadn't joined, very, very difficult to explain to them the processes, that their sufferings, they found it very difficult to celebrate in common with unionist veterans, because they would have found it difficult to have walked behind, for example, Union Jack and symbols of Britishness. They had joined specifically to create an specific Irish identity, and they had lost that. So there's little wonder then that even 1919, as the soldiers came home, there's a victory day, 9th of August 1919, where perhaps the figures are very vague, 25,000 to 35,000 soldiers from unionist background, 8th, 9th, 10th, 15th Division in formation, march. But Irish nationalists don't join in. Instead, on the 29th of July, they had held a rally in the old Celtic Park, where the park centre is now. St Peter's Brass Band there were games for the kids and so on. But it was a separate remembrance. Their experience were separate, difficult to explain, hard to justify in some ways, a source of embarrassment with division among Irish parliamentary politics as well. And so submerged, private, and only now emergent once again in a more nuanced understanding of a time when new dispensations are the time of us. Thank you very much.